Everyone expected him to beg. That was the unspoken agreement the room had reached before the meeting even began, that Michael Carter, the quiet operations manager who had spent 15 years keeping Phoenix Global running from the inside out, would stand in front of the executive board, bow his head, and plead his case with whatever dignity he could assemble under fluorescent light and institutional pressure. The conference room on the 42nd floor had been arranged with unusual deliberateness that morning. Leather chairs had been filled by senior directors and department heads who had rescheduled morning meetings to be present, who had arrived early and poured their own coffee and taken seats around the long mahogany table, with the particular studied arrangement of people who expect to witness something. At the head of the table sat Victoria Lang, newly appointed chief executive, 40 years old, sharp-shouldered and sharper-eyed, with the kind of focused stillness that made assistants walk faster whenever they heard her heels in the corridor. She had been in the role for 11 weeks, and already the walls of Phoenix Global had absorbed the scent of change, restructured workflows, eliminated redundancies, performance reviews conducted without sentiment, meetings that began and ended on time because she believed lateness was simply disrespect in soft packaging. She was not cruel, the way cruelty requires pleasure. She was efficient. And efficiency, in her vocabulary, did not allow room for exceptions or for the sentimental elevation of tenure above performance. Michael stood near the doorway for a moment before entering, and anyone watching closely would have noticed something unusual. He was not nervous. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, in the way of a man who had worked with his hands before he worked with his mind, with close-cropped gray at his temples and eyes that absorbed a room without judgment. He wore the same pressed khaki shirt he wore every day, the same plain lanyard with his company badge, the same composure that his team had always described. When asked, as simply being Michael, he walked to the center of the room without rushing, pulled out the chair across from Victoria without waiting to be invited, and sat down. The room settled into a charged silence that pressed against the windows. People who had planned to look away found that they couldn't. There was something in the way he carried himself, not arrogance, not performance, but the particular quality of a man who has nothing to prove and has known it long enough that the knowledge has become invisible on him, folded into the ordinary way he moved through the world. He did not look at the assembled directors. He did not scan the room for allies. He simply sat and waited, with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that patience costs nothing and saves everything. The incident in question had occurred 4 days earlier, a cascading system failure in the company's data infrastructure that had taken 3 servers offline for 6 hours and triggered a contractual penalty clause with one of Phoenix Global's largest enterprise clients. The information technology director had submitted a report attributing the failure to a maintenance scheduling gap. The report pointed toward Michael's department. Victoria had read it that morning and decided before noon that the matter required a public accounting. She believed strongly, as she had written in a leadership article 2 years prior, that accountability without visibility was merely paperwork, a private record of a public failure. So she had called the meeting. She had invited the witnesses. The room had been filling since 9 o'clock in the morning, and by 9:30, when Michael arrived, there was not an empty chair, because everyone who worked on the 42nd floor had found a reason to be present, or had been quietly told to be present, and the expectation that filled the room was the same one that fills any room arranged around a foreordained outcome, the expectation of confirmation. They expected him to explain. They expected him to apologize. They expected him, at the very least, to perform the ritual of institutional accountability, to accept the shape of the story that had been written before he arrived, and to add his voice to it in the appropriate places. Victoria did not open with pleasantries. She rarely did. She set the report on the table between them, pushed it forward 3 inches, and said simply and clearly, "Mr. Carter, either explain this failure or consider your position here terminated." Her voice carried no cruelty, only precision. She was asking for a performance, and the performance she expected was contrition. What she received instead was something the room had no ready category for. Michael looked at the report without touching it. He looked at Victoria with an expression that she would describe to herself later as measured, not cold, not defiant, but measured, like a man taking the temperature of a situation he has already fully diagnosed. He looked at the room slowly, calmly, the way a man surveys a landscape he has memorized and is seeing for the last time, not with grief but with a kind of private completion. He took a breath. He did not raise his voice. He did not lower his eyes. He said, in a tone that barely required the room's silence to be heard, "If that is your decision, I respect it." Nothing more. He reached up, unclipped his badge from the lanyard, and placed it on the conference table with a small, precise sound, like the period at the end of a sentence that has been a long time coming. Then he rose, straightened his chair behind him, a detail several people in the room would remember later, and not be able to explain why it moved them, and walked toward the door at a pace that was neither hurried nor reluctant, simply steady, the pace of a man whose internal compass had already resolved the situation before anyone else in the room had finished processing it. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment felt strangely sacred in a way no one could explain and no one would try to in the days that followed. Victoria watched him go with her expression arranged in its usual composure. But something behind her eyes was working a flicker of recalibration. She would not acknowledge for several days. The door closed. The room exhaled. Several of the senior directors exchanged glances that carried meaning they did not put into words. One of them, a man named Gerald Hicks, who had been with the company for 22 years and had watched 3 chief executives come and go like weather systems, turned toward the window and said nothing at all, but his jaw was tight. And that, for those who knew him, said everything. A younger analyst near the back of the room later told a colleague that the whole thing had felt like watching someone fold a flag. Deliberate, quiet, and impossibly final. Victoria gathered the report. She told her assistant to schedule a press briefing about the system failure. She did not look at the badge Michael had left behind, still centered on the conference table, until everyone else had gone. When she finally looked at it, she picked it up, turned it over once, and set it back down. She did not know yet what she was holding. In the days that followed, the silence of Michael Carter's absence announced itself in ways that no formal departure ever quite manages to produce. He had not left a forwarding address. His company email account, deactivated within the standard 48-hour window, received no auto-reply. The mobile number on his human resources file rang twice before going to a voicemail that had been cleared and never re-recorded. Just dead air where a voice should have been. His parking badge was returned to reception in a plain envelope with no note inside, no explanation, no sentiment. Just the object itself, delivered and done. Victoria received the standard separation paperwork, signed and notarized, and filed it without sentiment. She told herself, this was how things were supposed to go. Clean, documented, efficient. She had a company to run, and she intended to run it with the precision that her board had hired her to deliver. She had restructured a regional operations team of 40 people in her previous role without losing sleep. The removal of one mid-level manager should have registered as a rounding error in the ledger of leadership decisions. The problems began quietly, the way they always do. A vendor that supplied critical cooling components to the company's server infrastructure sent a brief email informing Phoenix Global that they were pausing their service contract pending a review of terms. No explanation, no anger. Just the pause, polite, opaque, final in the way that things are final when the relationship sustaining them has been interrupted at its source. Victoria's operations team spent 3 days attempting to re-establish contact before discovering that the vendor's owner, a man named Daniel Briggs, who ran a precision parts manufacturing business out of Indianapolis, had conducted all of his dealings at Phoenix Global through a single point of contact for nearly a decade. That contact was Michael Carter, not because the contract required it, not because Michael was the highest-ranking person involved, not because any policy or procedure had designated him as the relationship manager, simply because Daniel Briggs had once said, in a recorded vendor review meeting that nobody had listened to in 7 years, that he only did business with people he trusted. And the person he trusted at Phoenix Global was Michael. Not the contracts, not the purchase orders. Michael, the person who answered when he called, the person who showed up when there was a problem, the person who never made him feel like a line item. The same pattern appeared elsewhere, each instance quiet on its own and collectively alarming. A logistics partner in Denver stopped responding to routine scheduling requests. A software audit firm that Phoenix Global used for quarterly compliance checks sent a measured note saying they were reviewing their client relationships and would be in touch. A real estate broker who had handled 3 of the company's office expansions in the past 5 years sent a short message to the acquisitions department saying she would not be renewing her service agreement effective at the end of the current engagement. None of these were contractual crises, individually. Together, they constituted a slow withdrawal of goodwill, like a tide going out in the dark, revealing how much of the shore had been quietly, continuously maintained by a man no one had thought to ask about when he was present, and no one could replace now that he was gone. Victoria called an internal meeting. She asked her operations director why so many of the company's informal vendor relationships ran through the same name. The operations director, a woman named Karen Alvarez, who had joined Phoenix Global 3 years ago and had been quietly in awe of Michael's network since her first week, chose her words carefully. She said, because he built them. He built most of them personally, over a very long time, outside of any formal structure. Victoria's expression did not change, but she asked Karen to pull every file that referenced Michael Carter's name and to have them on her desk by morning. Karen said she would. Then, on her way out, she paused with her hand on the doorframe and said without turning around, because many times, this company couldn't survive without him. She left the sentence in the room like a key left in a lock. She did not wait to see whether Victoria would turn it. It was Gerald Hicks who sent the envelope. Victoria found it on her desk on a Thursday morning. No sender's name, no note attached, just a plain manila envelope sealed with tape that had been pressed down with unusual care. Inside was a collection of documents that had clearly been assembled over time by someone who understood exactly what they meant and had been waiting for the right moment to ensure they were read. Financial statements spanning 15 years, internal memoranda, board minutes from years past, and a set of handwritten ledger pages that looked as though they had been photocopied from something kept in a private drawer for a very long time. Victoria sat down. She did not have her assistant hold her calls. She did not check her calendar or her messages. She read for 3 hours without stopping, and with every document she turned, the version of Phoenix Global she thought she understood receded a little further, until she was reading about a company she barely recognized, not because it was different from the one she ran, but because she had been seeing only its visible surface. There was a procurement crisis from 11 years ago, in which the company had faced a penalty judgment of $38 million from a federal contracting dispute. The litigation had been resolved in Phoenix Global's favor through what the legal records described only as a confidential settlement facilitated by a third-party intermediary. There was no public record of who that intermediary was, but a footnote in an internal audit memorandum written in the kind of dry, meticulous language that meant someone had tried very hard to make it sound unremarkable, identified the facilitator only by his employee number, Michael's employee number. There was a supply chain collapse from 7 years back, when a primary manufacturing partner had abruptly dissolved its contract, threatening 2 product launch timelines that represented 42% of the company's projected annual revenue. A handwritten note from the previous chief executive, a man named Robert Caldwell, who had retired 4 years ago, said only, "Michael handled it. Do not let this become a talking point." The supply chain had been rebuilt over 6 weeks. The product launches had proceeded on schedule. No one below the executive level had ever been told why, or how, or by whom. The story had simply not been told. And then, at the bottom of the envelope, there was a single sheet of paper that was different from the rest. It was not a financial document or a legal record. It was a private letter, handwritten on plain paper, dated 15 years ago, signed by Robert Caldwell, and addressed to no one in particular. In it, Robert described a moment during the company's founding period when a catastrophic funding gap had threatened to end Phoenix Global before it had truly begun. He wrote that the company had been saved not by a board resolution or an emergency loan, but by a single act of private generosity from a young employee who had asked for nothing in return, except that the matter never be discussed. He did not name the employee in the letter. He did not need to. Victoria already knew. She sat for a long time after she finished reading, the documents arranged in front of her in the order she had read them. Through the glass wall of her office, she could see the floor of the company, She now ran analysts at their desks, assistants moving between meeting rooms, the ordinary machinery of a billion-dollar operation running on its own momentum, sustained by 10,000 small and unremarkable acts of diligence, performed daily by people who assumed the infrastructure they worked within had always simply been there. She thought about the morning of the board meeting. She thought about the conference table, the report she had pushed across it. She thought about the sound of a badge placed on polished wood. She thought about Michael Carter's face when he had said, "If that is your decision, I respect it," not the face of a man accepting defeat, but the face of a man confirming something he had already privately and quietly concluded. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water poured over certainty, that she had made a profound mistake, not an operational error. A mistake about what a person was worth, and how worth gets built, and what happens when you fail to look at the architecture before you tear the wall down. She called Karen Alvarez into her office that afternoon and told her to find Michael Carter. Karen did not ask why. She simply said she would try. 2 weeks later, she told Victoria, with careful diplomacy, that Michael did not appear to want to be found. His personal address on file had not been updated in 4 years and corresponded to an apartment in the city he no longer occupied. None of his former colleagues had a current number. None of his known acquaintances had heard from him since the day he left the building. He had simply stepped out of the world he had occupied and allowed it to close behind him as though he had never been there, not dramatically, not in anger, but with the thoroughness of a man who had already been planning his exit long before he was shown the door. Victoria told Karen to keep trying. And then she did something she had not planned to do. She started making calls herself. What she learned, over the weeks that followed, reconstructed the man with a thoroughness that humbled her in a way she had not been humbled in years. She spoke to Daniel Briggs in Indianapolis, who told her that Michael had once driven 6 hours on a Saturday, his own day, his own car, his own time to help him troubleshoot a parts defect that was technically not Phoenix Global's problem, because the defect would have caused delays that would have cost Daniel's small business a significant client relationship that it could not afford to lose. She spoke to the logistics partner in Denver, a man named Travis Cole, who ran a mid-sized freight operation, who said that Michael had personally guaranteed a delivery schedule during a severe weather crisis 3 years ago using his own relationships with regional carriers, relationships he had built on his own time, on his own credibility, in the spaces most people reserved for rest. She spoke to the software audit firm's principal, a woman named Sandra Whitmore, who worked out of Charlotte, who said that she had stayed with Phoenix Global as a client for 9 consecutive years, not because of the contract terms, but because every time there was a problem, Michael Carter had picked up the phone and dealt with it like a human being rather than a corporate representative. "He never made you feel like a vendor," Sandra said. "He made you feel like someone he actually gave a damn about." Victoria wrote that sentence down on a legal pad and underlined it twice. She had heard some version of it from every person she contacted, phrased differently, in different contexts, from different corners of the country, but pointing always toward the same center. The same man, the same quality of attention that turns professional relationships into something that holds. She flew to Atlanta because a former board member, an older man named Elliot Marsh, who had served during Robert Caldwell's tenure, agreed to meet her for breakfast at a diner near his home. He was 71 years old and retired, and had no obligation to explain anything. But he had heard through channels that Victoria was asking questions, and he had decided the answers deserved to be given properly. Over coffee and eggs, he told her about 15 years ago. He told her that Robert Caldwell, for all his vision, had over-leveraged the company during a rapid expansion phase and had been unable to secure emergency bridge financing when a major investor backed out without warning. He told her that the company had been 45 days from default, that the lawyers had already begun preparing insolvency documents, that the board had privately accepted the likelihood of a formal dissolution proceeding. He told her that a 27-year-old operations coordinator named Michael Carter had walked into Robert's office on a Monday morning with a certified check representing the entirety of his personal savings, a figure Elliot described only as enough to matter, and declined to specify further, and had placed it on the desk without drama or negotiation or any visible expectation of reciprocity. He had asked for no equity, no promotion, no formal acknowledgement in any record or document. He had said, According to Robert's own account of the meeting, only one thing. Don't tell anyone. Just keep the doors open. The company had survived. Michael had gone back to his desk. Life had continued in the way that life continues when a private sacrifice has been made and honored, quietly and without ceremony. Victoria asked Elliot why Michael had never been compensated in proportion to what he had done. Elliot looked out the diner window for a long moment before answering. Robert offered, he said. More than once. Over more than a few years. Michael always declined. He said he didn't need it. He paused. At the time, we took that to mean he was being modest, or that he didn't want to create awkwardness. Looking back, I think he simply meant it literally. She flew to Maine because Karen's investigative firm had traced a property registration to a small house near the water. Purchased 4 years ago in the name of a quiet family trust. It had taken 4 weeks and considerable patience to locate. Victoria had not told her board she was going. She had not told her communications director, her executive assistant, or her chief of staff. She had booked the flight herself, early on a Tuesday morning in October, and landed at a small regional airport in the late afternoon, with a carry-on bag and no security detail. Just a woman in a dark coat and good shoes, driving a rental car along a 2-lane road lined with birch trees gone silver in the fall light. The road narrowed as it approached the coast, the trees opening onto rocky hillsides, and she drove with the particular concentration of someone trying to stay focused on the road rather than on what waits at the end of it. She arrived at a gravel driveway that led to a white clapboard house with a covered porch overlooking a rocky beach. Beyond a small stand of pines, the Atlantic spread gray and wide and indifferent. The way the ocean is always indifferent, which is not cruelty but simply scale. There was a truck in the driveway, an older model, nothing conspicuous. There was a garden along the south wall, obviously tended by someone who cared about it in the practical, unhurried way of people who garden because it grounds them, rather than because it impresses anyone. Low plantings, carefully arranged, late-season color doing what it could. There were no gates, no cameras, no visible security of any kind. Just a house that belonged to a man who had decided that peace was worth more than proximity to the world that had once used him and quietly discarded him. And who had made that decision without bitterness, which is the hardest kind of decision to make because it requires giving up the one comfort grievance offers: the feeling of being right. She pulled in beside the truck and sat for a moment in the car. She was, by any measure, a powerful woman. She had run a company. She had made thousands of decisions affecting thousands of people without hesitation and without apology. Because she had believed that efficiency was a form of respect. Sitting in that driveway, in the quiet and the October light, she understood for the first time that she had confused efficiency with understanding. They were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. She got out. She walked to the door. She stood at the threshold for a long moment before knocking. She thought about all the things she had rehearsed on the plane, the acknowledgments, the structured apology with its 3 components, the forward-looking close about shared value creation, and she understood, standing in the Atlantic wind, with the salt smell of the water reaching her from somewhere beyond the house, that none of those versions would survive first contact with a man who had spent 15 years choosing authenticity over appearance. She knocked. She waited. 20 minutes passed before she heard movement inside. Another 10 before the door opened. Michael looked the same as he had in the conference room, and somehow entirely different, more settled was the word she decided on later. Sitting in the airport waiting for her flight back. He was wearing a work shirt and old jeans and holding a cup of coffee, and he regarded her the way he had regarded the board meeting, which is to say without hostility and without particular surprise, as though he had been half expecting her and had simply waited to see how long it would take and whether she was the kind of person who would bother. He did not invite her in immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, not calculating, not theatrical, just looking. The way people look at things they need to assess honestly before committing to them. Then he said, "You want to sit on the porch?" It was not a question. She said yes. He held the door open, and they sat in wooden chairs facing the water, and the wind came off the Atlantic with the smell of salt and enormous distance, and neither of them spoke for almost 5 minutes, which was the longest silence Victoria had experienced in a professional context in 11 years. She did not fill it with strategy. She did not reach for talking points or the language of institutional correction. She let the silence exist between them, and that was harder for her than it sounds, because she had built a career on the premise that silence is a resource to be managed, rather than a condition to be inhabited. She said, "I owe you an apology." She had rehearsed versions of this sentence on the flight. The formal version, the disarmed version, the version that opened into an explanation, the version that preceded a business proposal and none of them had felt right, and the version she finally said was the simplest one, because all the elaborate framings had collapsed under their own weight on the drive from the airport, leaving only the plain fact of the thing. Michael turned his coffee cup in his hands. He looked at the water. He said, "Yes. Not don't worry about it. Not water under the bridge. Not the cushioning, face-saving, relationship-preserving deflection that most people in his position would have offered, because most people in his position would have wanted her to feel better about what had been done to them. Just yes, an honest acknowledgement that an apology was, in fact, owed. And somehow the directness of it was more disarming than any forgiveness would have been, because forgiveness can be a kind of power. A decision to release someone from a debt, whereas his simple yes just confirmed the shape of what had happened without offering her either relief or resentment. Victoria felt the rehearsed version of herself, the composed, controlled, forward-looking executive, slip sideways, and she told him everything she had found. The files, Elliot Marsh over eggs in Atlanta, Daniel Briggs talking about a 6-hour Saturday drive, Travis Cole's weather crisis, Sandra Whitmore's 9-year loyalty, the certified check that had kept 45 days from becoming 0. She laid it out without scaffolding, without the protective framing of professional language. Just the plain accumulation of facts about a man she had dismissed in a single morning with a single sentence. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What surprised me wasn't being let go. I always knew I could be replaced on an org chart. Everyone can be, eventually. The thing that surprised me was that nobody asked. If someone had just asked, I would have explained everything. The system failure, the vendor context, the decision that led to the scheduling gap, the reasoning behind it. I wasn't hiding anything. I just didn't think anyone needed the full picture until they did." He looked at her, and apparently by then, the conclusion had already been drawn. He was not accusing her. He was naming it clearly and precisely, the way he named everything, because clarity is a form of respect, and he had decided, at some point in his life, to extend it, even to the people who had not extended it to him. Victoria put her hands over her face for a long moment. When she lowered them, her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. She said, "I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry." He looked at her, and what completed her resolve was that he was not performing mercy, not offering her a transaction in which she confessed, and he absolved, and both parties walked away balanced. He was actually at peace. That kind of peace, she understood sitting on that porch in the Atlantic wind, is not something given to you by circumstance or by the behavior of other people. It is built over years, through deliberate choices about who you will be when the world gives you permission to be otherwise. He said, "Robert Caldwell hired my father when nobody else would. When I was 12 years old and my family was struggling in ways I didn't fully understand until I was much older. That company was the thing that made the difference. I never forgot it. So I stayed, and I protected it when I could. Not for recognition, and not for compensation, just because it was the right thing to do, and because I knew how, and because being useful to something worth protecting is its own kind of reward." He looked back at the water. After a while, it wasn't even about the debt. It was just who I was, who I wanted to be. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I came to ask if there's any version of this where you'd be willing to come back. Not as an employee, as someone who has a real stake in what happens next." He looked at the water. He said, "Let me think about it." She said, "Take all the time you need." She drove back to the airport in the dark and sat at the gate for an hour before her flight, and felt, for the first time in many weeks, that she might have done something right. There are things about Michael Carter that Victoria had not discovered during her investigation, not because they were hidden but because no one she interviewed had thought to mention them. or because they were the kind of things that feel too private for business conversation, that live in a different register than vendor, contracts, and board minutes. He had a daughter. Her name was Ellie. She was 14, and she had lived with him full-time for the past 6 years after her mother had relocated abroad for work, and Michael had become her primary parent by circumstance, and then by deep and deliberate choice. Ellie was the reason he had kept the house in Maine for 4 years before he finally moved into it. He had wanted her to grow up near the ocean, not because it was romantic, but because he had read that children with access to natural landscapes tended to develop patience, and patience was the quality he most wanted to give her. He had driven her to school every morning for 6 years, made her breakfast, helped with homework at the kitchen table in the evenings. When she had gone through a difficult period in 7th grade, withdrawing from friends, struggling with anxiety that settled into her like a stone she couldn't identify, he had quietly rearranged his entire work schedule to be home by 4 o'clock every afternoon, declining meetings, deferring reports, absorbing the professional cost without complaint, because some things matter more than professional cost, and a child in pain is one of them. None of this had appeared in his performance reviews. None of it was relevant to his operational metrics. It was simply the other half of who he was, the part that existed outside the 42nd floor, in the ordinary and irreplaceable business of raising a person who trusted him completely. Ellie had taken the move to Maine with the composure of someone who had watched her father handle disruption without complaint for years, and had decided, instinctively, to take her cues from him. He called Victoria 3 weeks after Maine. His conditions were clear and stated without apology. A board-level title that reflected his actual function. Full ownership of the vendor relationships he had built, with no one positioned above him in those conversations, and non-negotiable flexibility for his daughter, whose schedule came before everything. Victoria said yes to each condition without hesitation, and when he said one more thing, no more decisions about people without actually knowing the person. First, she said, "I understand." And he said, "I know you do. That's why I'm calling." The annual shareholder meeting was held in the main auditorium of Phoenix Global's headquarters on a Thursday morning in early winter, attended by every senior employee and several dozen board members and institutional investors who had been watching the company's recent instability with the particular nervous attention of people who have significant money precisely where their anxiety is. The room seated 300, and it was full. Victoria stood at the podium in a dark blazer and addressed the crowd with a directness that was both familiar and somehow different from the directness she had deployed 11 weeks earlier in that conference room on the 42nd floor. Less performance, more substance, the difference between someone who has rehearsed a thing and someone who has lived it and knows now what the thing costs and what it is worth. She announced structural changes to the leadership model, specific and detailed, the kind of changes that come from genuine understanding, rather than external pressure. She announced the reinstatement of several vendor relationships that had been paused. She announced the re-signing of the enterprise client with terms she described as favorable to both parties, because they were. And then she said something that was not in any version of the pre-circulated talking points, that had not been reviewed by communications or legal, that had been written only by the experience of the past several months, and the particular clarity that experience requires when it has cost you something real and forced you to look directly at what your choices made of you. She said, "Before any of that, I owe this company and its people a public acknowledgement. Several weeks ago, I made a decision about a person without understanding who that person was. I allowed an incomplete picture to guide a consequential judgment, and I did not slow down long enough to ask the questions that might have corrected that picture. That is not the kind of leadership I was brought here to provide, and it is not the kind of leader I intend to be going forward." The room was very quiet, the particular quiet of people who are paying full attention rather than waiting for the next slide. She said, "The man I'm talking about is Michael Carter. Many of you know him. Most of you, I suspect, did not know everything about him. I didn't. He is the reason this company survived 3 separate crises that would have ended us. He is the reason we still have the partnerships and the reputation that allow us to sit in this room together. He never asked for credit. He never asked for recognition. He did what he did because he believed it was the right thing to do. Because he had been given something years ago by this company that he never forgot and never stopped trying to repay, even when no one was keeping count, and I repaid that by asking him to leave. The silence in the room was not the silence of shock, it was the silence of recognition. 200 people simultaneously understanding something they had half known for a long time, something that had lived in the texture of the company's culture without ever being named, that had given certain meetings their steadiness and certain crises their resolution, without anyone quite being able to say why. Someone at the back of the room began to applaud. It spread in the way that real applause spreads, not the polite, reflexive kind that fills a room because it would be awkward to withhold, but the kind that comes from somewhere specific in a person's chest, because something true has been said out loud, and the body's first instinct is to confirm it. Michael walked in from the side entrance. He was wearing a good jacket, dark and well cut, the kind that looked comfortable rather than formal on him. And beside him was Ellie, who was smiling at the floor, in the way teenagers smile when they are prouder of their parents than they have the vocabulary to say, and would rather die than admit it in a room full of adults in business attire. He took his seat at the board table as the room continued to stand, and he looked out at the applause, with the same composed attention he had brought to every difficult moment of his professional life, receiving it without being diminished by it, without performing humility or false modesty, without flinching from what had been genuinely and completely earned over 15 years of quiet, unrewarded work. He looked like himself. That was the thing several people remarked on afterward. That he looked exactly like himself, as if nothing that had happened had added or removed anything from the essential quality of the man. Which perhaps was the point. And perhaps was the whole story. Victoria introduced him as a new strategic board member and primary advisor on external partnerships, a title that had been written by someone who had finally learned to ask the right questions and to listen carefully enough to hear the answers. He was also, as subsequent company disclosures reflected, a beneficial shareholder of meaningful significance. The investment fund he had been quietly building for a decade had made him, in purely financial terms, one of the company's most consequential individual stakeholders. He had never held the shares under his own name. He had never mentioned them to anyone at Phoenix Global. He had simply watched, from a position of silent co-ownership, as the company he had once saved with his own savings grew into a billion-dollar enterprise, and he had asked for nothing except the opportunity to keep doing the work he had always found worth doing, for reasons that no organizational chart had ever been designed to capture. The months that followed were quiet and consistent, which is the only kind of recovery that holds. Michael re-established contact with the vendors who had paused. He flew to Indianapolis and had dinner with Daniel Briggs, who came back to the contract without conditions and without fanfare, just a handshake and a shared meal, and the understanding, renewed between two people who had known each other long enough to skip preamble, that the underlying relationship had never actually broken. He called Travis Cole and Sandra Whitmore, and the conversations were brief because the trust that had frayed was not broken, only in need of confirmation that the person they had trusted was still present and still the same. He was. He always had been. The enterprise client that had terminated their contract sent a careful inquiry in the third month asking whether Phoenix Global would be open to renegotiation. Victoria brought the inquiry to Michael without editorializing. He called the client's operations director directly, on a Friday afternoon, and talked for 40 minutes not about contract language or penalty clauses or liability frameworks, but about what the client actually needed in the next 2 years, and whether Phoenix Global could genuinely and sustainably provide it. The contract was reinstated the following week, with terms more favorable than the original version. The stock recovered steadily over the subsequent quarter. The press moved on to other stories, as it always does when the crisis narrative stops producing new material, and the company, without announcement or ceremony, became more stable than it had been in years. Not the brittle stability of a system running on bluster and momentum, but the settled stability of an organization that has been honestly examined and honestly repaired. Victoria and Michael met formally twice a week in the beginning, reviewing partnership strategy and operational priorities in a conference room that was, by some unspoken agreement, always the smaller one, not the boardroom where the separation had been announced, but a quieter room down the hall with a window that looked out over the park rather than the city's glass towers. Their working style turned out to be complementary in ways that neither had anticipated, and both came to rely on more than they initially admitted. She worked from structure outward. He worked from relationships inward. She was quickest with frameworks and financial modeling, and the kind of systemic thinking that sees organizations as architectures to be designed and stress-tested. He was quickest with people with the specific intuition of someone who had spent 15 years paying close attention to what others needed before they fully articulated it, who had learned to hear the thing beneath the thing being said. They disagreed sometimes, respectfully, and with the particular directness of people who have already survived a difficult honesty between them, and know their relationship is sturdy enough to hold a different opinion without fracturing. Neither of them treated consensus as the goal. They treated accuracy as the goal, and consensus was what happened when they both arrived there from different directions. Their colleagues noticed, first with curiosity and then with the quiet satisfaction of people watching something work properly, that the two of them produced better decisions together than either would have produced alone, and that the company had a different quality in the months after Michael's return, less driven by the performance of confidence, more grounded in something that felt like actual competence, the earned and tested kind that does not need to announce itself. On a Saturday in May, they stood together on the rooftop terrace of Phoenix Global's headquarters. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that turns everything it touches golden and slightly unreal, softening the glass towers of the surrounding city into something that looked almost deliberate, as though the light had been arranged by someone who understood composition. The city spread out below them, in the particular silence of high places, not true silence, but the distance-muffled version of the city's ordinary noise, which amounts to the same thing. Ellie was downstairs, having extracted a promise from Victoria to show her the technology lab on the 41st floor, which she had declared in the elevator actually kind of fascinating, delivered in the flat, considered tone of a 14-year-old who has calibrated standards and will not lower them for anyone's benefit, including her own enthusiasm. Victoria had promised. She meant to keep it. She had been learning, in the months since Maine, that promises made to people who trust you are not obligations to be managed but commitments to be honored, and that the difference between the two is not semantic but essential. The difference, in fact, between the kind of leadership that loses people and the kind that keeps them. Victoria stood at the railing with her hands in her coat pockets and looked out at the city. She was not thinking about operations or partnerships or the presentation she had to give on Monday. She was thinking about a conference room 11 months ago and a badge placed on a table and a man who had walked away without explaining himself. And she was thinking about the cost of that moment, not in revenue or in stock price, but in the quieter currency of trust and understanding that no quarterly report has ever been designed to capture. She said, "I almost lost the best person I've ever met." She said it quietly, not as a confession requiring absolution or an admission requiring response, but as an observation, the kind you make when you have processed something long enough that you can finally say it out loud without it demanding anything more from you than honesty. It was the kind of sentence that a different version of herself would never have said aloud, because it acknowledged something that could not be converted into strategy or leverage or competitive advantage. It was simply true. And she was saying it because he deserved to hear it. And because she had decided somewhere between Maine and the shareholder meeting and the dozens of small, careful, ordinary conversations that had followed that being the kind of person who says true things, even the ones that cost you something, was the only kind of person worth being. Michael stood beside her, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and he looked out at the same city she was looking at, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the spring wind came off the rooftop, carrying the smell of the season, something green, something beginning. He smiled. It was the smile she had first seen in the conference room 15 weeks ago, when she had expected him to beg, and he had simply and completely declined, to the smile of a man who has so thoroughly decided who he is that the world's attempts to define him otherwise find no purchase anywhere in him, not in his posture or his expression or the way he occupies a room. It was, she had come to understand, not the smile of a man who had won anything. It was the smile of a man who had never been playing the game that winning and losing require. He said, "But you came looking." She turned her head to look at him. He was still smiling. She smiled back, not the careful, composed smile of an executive managing an impression, but the unguarded kind. the kind that surprises the face before the brain has approved it. Below them, in the golden light of a late spring afternoon, a company that had survived by loyalty and luck, and one man's quiet willingness to ask for nothing in return for everything, moved forward. The only way anything real ever does, carried by people willing to tell each other the truth about what they owe, patient enough to wait for the right moment, honest enough to say the thing that costs something, and brave enough, finally and without reservation, to stay until the truth is heard and the person in front of you sees you clearly for the first time and decides that what they see is worth keeping and worth being. Some things are only built that way. There is no shortcut. There never was. Michael Carter had always known it. Victoria Lang was still learning. And that, in the end, was the most important thing about her. That she was the kind of person who could,